The Doyle house stood apart from the scattered farms of rural Pennsylvania, a square and heavy structure of dark timber that never seemed to belong to the land it claimed. Its shutters were nailed in place, always closed, though neighbors said they sometimes saw faint light slip through the cracks as if the walls themselves breathed. The fields around it grew in strange patterns, with corn twisted into spirals and patches of rye left to rot, as though someone had arranged decay itself with care. To travelers on the dirt road it was simply a lonely farmhouse, but those who lived nearby knew there was something different about the way silence clung to it, how even the crows circling above seemed reluctant to settle on its roof. Mothers told their children to keep away from the boundary fence, warning them that the Doyle family had their own ways of keeping order, ways that no decent Christian home should claim. Still, some nights after dusk, the air filled with faint laughter that carried across the open fields, high-pitched and uneven. The kind of laughter that did not sound like play but like practice, as if unseen voices were being forced to repeat the shape of joy without ever feeling it. Inside, Callum Doyle moved with precision through the rooms, a man whose every habit had hardened into ritual. To his neighbors, he was only a quiet immigrant farmer who had left the noise of Dublin behind, but behind the nailed shutters he lived by a discipline that no one dared imagine. He kept a ledger in which he recorded the smallest detail of his family's life, not in words of affection but in numbers, dates, and sketches of postures he demanded his children hold while standing in corners for hours. He was convinced that order was the highest form of faith, that silence proved the soul's submission, and that laughter could be taught like handwriting. When his wife Bridget's voice rose above the stillness, he wrote down the exact minute it broke the quiet, marking it in red as if it were a wound. The house itself seemed to absorb his hunger for control. Its rooms stripped bare of decoration, its windows blocked from the sun until even the walls seemed starved of light. The neighbors whispered about children they thought they saw on the property, pale shapes running through the rows at dusk, faces too far to recognize. They counted more than the 2 children known to belong to the Doyle family, and when they asked about it, Callum would only nod politely, saying that cousins often came to stay for the season. Yet no one ever saw them arrive or depart. The laughter that floated across the fields never carried the joy of cousins reunited. It was sharp and thin, cut into the air like the sound of metal drawn across stone. Some nights it broke off suddenly as though a hand had closed around a throat, leaving the fields silent again, save for the wind moving through hollow stalks. The fear of the house grew not from what people knew, but from what they could not explain. Crops that bordered the Doyle land withered faster than others, and animals strayed from pastures if their paths crossed the Doyle fence. Men working late claimed they saw the glint of lanterns on the property, swinging in measured lines as if a procession walked the rows, though no church feast was marked on those nights. Women spoke of dreams in which they heard children begging from beneath the earth, calling from a place too deep to dig. The stories passed in whispers at the market, in muttered prayers during Mass, but no one ever confronted Callum. His manner was calm, his eyes steady, his farm orderly enough to appear respectable. The evil of it was how easily the surface of normalcy covered what lay beneath. By autumn of 1831, the Doyle homestead had become more than a house. To the community it was a warning, a reminder that something unseen was taking shape behind nailed shutters and locked cellar doors. Some claimed that the house itself seemed to lean toward the fields, as if it were watching what it owned, guarding the laughter that did not belong to it. What lived inside was not yet spoken of in full, but the silence had already begun to feed on those who passed too near. And as winter pressed closer, the Doyle land seemed to grow hungrier still, waiting for its season of harvest, when what was hidden inside would finally show itself. Callum Doyle did not bring famine with him when he left Ireland. he brought something far heavier. Behind his calm gaze lay years of apprenticeship under a man whose name was whispered but rarely written. Lord Seamus Kavanagh of Dublin, a noble whose house never emptied of the sick and the desperate, yet whose patients were seldom seen again once they entered his gates. Kavanagh was not a physician by right but by indulgence of wealth. He believed the body could be bent to unlock truths beyond faith or science. And in his cellar he practiced upon the poor who thought they had been saved. Callum, then a boy with quick hands and no inheritance, became the servant who stayed longest, learning to move silently, to hold down limbs as skin was opened, to measure the breath as it rattled away. For him, death was never shocking. It was a calculation, an answer to an equation that could be repeated until perfected. In those years, Dublin was plagued by rumors of body snatching, of corpses lifted from graves to supply the hungry tables of men who claimed to be scholars. Yet what Kavanagh pursued was not anatomy alone. He ordered Callum to cut open a beggar not at the chest, as physicians did, but at the soles of the feet, believing the nerves there carried unseen lines to the soul. He sewed iron filings into the wounds and left the man in darkness for days, instructing Callum to record how long it took before the subject stopped crying out. The screams, he insisted, were proof of the body rejecting Earth's impurities. Callum listened, learned, and memorized the way pain could be written into flesh like scripture. Each victim's collapse was not seen as cruelty but as progress, another step closer to whatever hidden order Kavanagh claimed to see. When famine tightened its grip on Ireland, Callum had already been changed by these rituals. He married Bridget not for love but for her resilience, for she bore the hunger with silence rather than complaint. Silence was what Callum valued most. He spoke little even when neighbors shared news of dying fields, but in secret he kept notes on the bodies that famine left in the streets, bodies stiff and wasted, their eyes hollow. He would stand at night over the dead left outside churches, pressing their mouths open with his thumb, imagining the ways sound might be forced from them if air still moved through their ruined lungs. What others saw as horror, he saw as a resource of lessons unspoken. When ships promised passage to America, Callum did not flee famine as the others did. He carried with him the methods he had learned, the cuts, the silences, the belief that control over suffering revealed a higher truth. On the long crossing of the Atlantic, sickness spread fast among passengers. Children coughed until they drowned in their own fluids, and mothers prayed for mercy. Callum watched, untouched by grief, taking note of how long the gasps lasted, how the trembling of hands slowed once the body surrendered. At night he moved among the bunks and pressed rags over faces just long enough to feel the panic quicken, then release before death could claim them. To the others he was helping soothe feverish restlessness. To himself he was refining the lessons of Dublin, proving that pain could be drawn out like a thread, tightened and loosened at will. Bridget sensed something in him, but famine and faith dulled her fear. She followed because there was nothing left to follow in Ireland but graves. By the time the Doyle family reached Pennsylvania, Callum's mind had hardened into certainty. He believed America was a land not of promise but of silence, wide fields where no one could hear what was buried. He built his house with its shutters nailed closed, just as Kavanagh had built walls to conceal his cellar. He measured every window, every beam, not for beauty but for control, creating a place where sound would not escape. The community saw only an immigrant farmer, quiet and hard-working. But Callum knew he had carried across the sea not only tools and seed, but the discipline of suffering. In his ledger, he wrote the word order as his first entry. The same word Kavanagh had whispered over bodies that would never rise again. What he carried was not hunger nor grief, but a system sharpened in shadow. a method born from Dublin's silent basements, carried in memory across the waves, waiting for the moment when silence in a foreign land could be filled with new voices taught to laugh on command, new bodies broken not by famine but by the hand of a man who believed cruelty itself was his inheritance. The fields of Pennsylvania would soon become his laboratory, just as Dublin's alleys had been Kavanaugh's. The land was quiet now, but Callum's silence was never peace. It was preparation. The Doyle fields showed children when there should have been none. Neighbors counted their small bodies moving through rows of rye, their heads bowed as though they were herded, but none could name them. The Doyle family had 2 children recorded in the church registry, yet 6 or 7 could be seen at twilight, pale and barefoot, shadows flitting across the land. When asked, Callum only said he took in the hungry and gave them shelter, a kindness in times when many were cast aside. His voice was calm, his manner patient. And so people nodded, though they felt unease in their bones. They did not see what waited beneath the ground, where kindness ended and method began. The cellar of the Doyle house was colder than the soil that pressed against its stone walls. Callum kept it not as a place of storage, but as a classroom, one that obeyed his design of lessons without mercy. Here the children were stripped of their names and called only by numbers written in chalk on their foreheads as though they were pages in his ledger. He believed learning required suffering, that the body must be bent until the soul submitted. Against one wall stood chairs built of heavy oak, each with curved beams that forced the spine backward into the shape of a kneeling prayer. The children were lashed into them until their bones creaked, their arms pinned open in imitation of saints he had once seen painted in Dublin chapels. They were left in those positions for hours until muscle tore and the mind gave way to delirium. Callum called it discipline. The children called it nothing at all, for their voices were taken from them in silence. He invented lessons in ink, believing words should not only be read but consumed. At night he filled glass bottles with thick black fluid made from soot and vinegar. He pried open their mouths with wooden wedges and poured until it spilled down their throats, forcing them to choke, to swallow, to breathe in the liquid until coughs turned into rattles deep in the chest. He waited for the sound to change, noting how the ink darkened their lips, how their lungs began to whistle as if trying to write with air itself. One boy drowned slowly in the black, his breath bubbling like tar before it stopped. Callum watched closely, his hand steady on the ledger, and when it ended he marked a line as though a lesson had been completed. The others saw the body dragged away but were given no chance to grieve. Instead, they were told to recite scripture, their voices thin, their faces smeared with stains that would never wash away. He taught silence through fire. Quills sharpened to points were dipped in oil and lit until they glowed red. He pressed them against the soft curve of the children's ears, driving them through cartilage while whispering that words spoken too freely led to sin. Some screamed until the sound collapsed into sobs. Others fell into shock and did not make a sound at all. For Callum, both outcomes were proof of obedience. He left their ears raw and torn, bleeding down their necks, a permanent mark of correction. Days later, infections spread, fever twisting their small bodies, yet he called it purification, insisting the weak were being refined into something worthy. Each death was not treated as loss, but as part of a system. When one girl's back snapped under the strain of the prayer chair, leaving her unable to move, he declared that she had achieved perfect stillness. He wrapped her in linen and set her in the corner as a model for the others, a silent saint whose broken body reminded them of what was expected. They were forced to bow to her each morning, their knees striking the dirt floor until skin broke. Her lifeless eyes stared back, and in that gaze the children learned what Callum wanted most, that even death could be turned into instruction. The toll on their minds was slow, deliberate, They no longer cried for parents who might have searched for them, no longer begged for escape. Their thoughts became narrowed to Callum's lessons, to the terror of the next correction. They laughed when ordered, a high, thin sound practiced until it rang false in the air. He had taken them beyond fear and into emptiness, shaping them into shadows who carried his silence. Neighbors still swore they saw them running through the fields at dusk, but what they saw were not children any longer. They were remnants, emptied vessels of a method born in Dublin, perfected in Pennsylvania, bodies that had been taught that suffering was not punishment, but law. And in the cellar, Callum continued his work, each correction feeding the quiet hunger of a house that never opened its shutters. A hunger that would soon demand more. Word count, 750. Do you want me to take Chapter 4, The Widow's Inheritance, next and expand it into a fully immersive 700-word section, focusing on Bridget's slow poisoning and the grotesque way Callum turns her body into ritual inheritance for the children? Bridget Doyle's sickness began with small signs, so slight that the neighbors believed it was only the winter fever that struck so many in Pennsylvania's damp valleys. Her skin lost its color, her hands trembled when she tried to carry buckets of water, and her voice cracked when she sang hymns at night. Yet behind the nailed shutters, her decline was not left to chance. Callum watched it with the same calm precision he gave to every correction in his cellar. Each evening he prepared tinctures in a narrow glass vial, a mixture he had learned from Dublin's dark rooms where noblemen had spoken of metals as vessels of power. He pressed the liquid against her gums with a needle so thin it left no trace but pinpricks, feeding mercury drop by drop into her mouth until her teeth grew loose and her breath carried the faint metallic scent of rot. To him, Bridget was no longer wife but specimen. He recorded her wasting with neat lines in his ledger, marking the days her hair fell in greater clumps, noting how the yellowing of her eyes matched the slow swelling of her tongue. He measured her coughs, timing the rattling in her chest as if it were a metronome. Her suffering was not an accident of illness but an experiment in control, a test of how the body could be undone from within without a single outward strike. Bridget herself began to believe she was cursed, whispering prayers at night, unaware that her husband stood beside her bed watching the convulsions spread through her fingers with a stillness that suggested admiration. When her body grew too weak to rise, Callum kept her in a narrow bed in the back room, a chamber he visited like a chapel. He cleaned her skin not with care but with calculation, scraping away sores that opened along her gums, storing the shavings in small jars of oil as though they were relics. He shaved strands of her hair with a blade, dipping them in melted wax, sealing them in blocks that he hid among sacks of flour. The neighbors saw only that Bridget no longer appeared at church, that Callum told them she was resting from fever. They left baskets of food at the door, which he accepted with polite thanks. None knew that he had already begun turning her body into the very bread he fed to the children below. It was not madness that drove him, but a ritual logic. He believed that to inherit strength, the living must consume the dead, not in whole, but in fragments hidden within the ordinary. He ground flour with her wax-bound hair, kneaded it into dough, and baked loaves that smelled of warmth and nourishment. He carried them to the cellar, breaking them apart and forcing pieces into the mouths of the children he numbered and corrected. Some gagged, some swallowed in silence, but all became bound to Bridget's decay. He told them this was inheritance, that they carried within them the strength of the woman who had once borne life into the world. To Callum, this feeding was no act of love but of ownership, a way to make her body live again in the suffering of the young. Bridget's end came slow, a drawn-out surrender that took weeks. Her teeth fell loose in her mouth, her skin sagged as if drained of weight, and her eyes grew glassy, watching without focus. Callum leaned over her with a quill in hand, sketching the way her body folded into itself, the way her voice weakened until it was barely more than breath. When at last she exhaled and did not inhale again, he closed her eyes without expression. He did not bury her in the churchyard. Instead, he cut locks of her hair, removed the fingernails that had yellowed, and pressed them between the pages of his ledger. Her flesh he left to rot in the ground behind the house, unmarked, but her fragments remained woven into the ritual of his lessons. The neighbors whispered that her passing was sad but ordinary, a woman lost to sickness in a land that devoured many. Yet the Doyle house remained shuttered, the laughter from its cellar sharper than before, and loaves of bread still baked though no wife's hands touched the dough. What Bridget left behind was not memory but substance, scattered into the children Callum molded, turning her body into ritual inheritance. She had become part of his method, a ghost not in spirit but in the very grain of his cruel order. And with her death, the silence of the Doyle homestead deepened, preparing the way for a chamber below that would reach beyond even her suffering. Word count: 700. Do you want me to expand Chapter 5, The Chamber Beneath the Chamber next, showing how Callum builds a hidden ritual room where torment becomes more than correction, but a twisted imitation of scripture carved directly into the flesh of children? Beneath the Doyle cellar lay a secret that no neighbor ever imagined, a chamber that Callum had carved out with his own hands during long, silent nights. He had bricked the walls himself, stone by stone, sealing it so tightly that not even the damp air could escape. To reach it, he moved a hidden panel of earth behind the shelves where he kept flour and tools, descending by lantern into a room that was meant for no eyes but his own. This chamber was not built for storage nor for safety, but for ritual. Here he intended to take his work beyond correction and discipline, into something he believed approached revelation. The chamber smelled of lime and copper, the scent of materials he had mixed into the mortar to prevent rot. Iron rings were set into the walls at careful intervals, and from them hung frames of wood and rope. These were not crude tools, but designs Callum had planned with the memory of Dublin's dark practices guiding him. Each frame was built to bend a child into a shape that mirrored holy images, arms spread as if in crucifixion, spines arched to resemble kneeling saints, legs folded unnaturally tight to mimic depictions of martyrs in prayer. When bound, the children became icons of flesh, their silhouettes distorted until their bodies told stories of suffering older than they were. Callum spoke to them as if they were scripture. He told them that God's truth was not found in words but in the body, that the lines of the skin were verses waiting to be revealed. With a knife honed thin, he cut strips along their arms in careful patterns, not jagged but measured, following the imagined lines of text only he could see. Blood ran in threads down their pale skin, and he pressed cloths to catch it, smearing the stains across his ledger as though transcribing passages. He whispered that every line carved into flesh was a sentence written by heaven, and that their pain was the ink. For him, their screams were not agony, but a hymn. Some children died quickly, their bodies too small to withstand the loss of blood or the twisting of bones forced into sacred postures. Callum would step back, observing their last breaths with the stillness of a scribe finishing a page, and then he would cover their faces with linen as if closing a book. He never left their corpses in the chamber long, dragging them out to shallow graves beneath the fields. The soil above them grew uneven, so neighbors swore the land swelled and sank as if something restless moved beneath. Those who survived became shadows of themselves, their voices broken, their eyes vacant. When unbound, they no longer cried or begged. They stared at nothing, their silence proof to Callum that his lessons had carved deeper than flesh. One boy was kept alive for weeks in the chamber, his arms etched until scar tissue crossed itself in twisted grids. Callum forced him to stand in a frame that pulled his spine backward until it cracked, and still the boy made no sound. When Callum lowered him at last, his body bent permanently forward, his head hanging as if in endless prayer. Callum called him the living scripture, and he paraded him before the others, showing that silence could be absolute. The boy's hollow stare infected the rest, reminding them that survival meant obedience, and so they began to yield before the knife even touched their skin. Their minds fractured, and in their brokenness Callum found confirmation of his method. The chamber became the heart of the Doyle homestead, though no neighbor ever knew it existed. To those above, the house was only strange and silent. To those below, it was a tomb where the air itself pressed down like stone. Callum kept no candles lit except the single lantern he carried, making shadows loom across the bricked walls, turning every movement into a grotesque procession of saints. In those shadows, the children ceased to be children. They became figures of ritual, their pain twisted into patterns meant to satisfy one man's vision of divine order. And when he emerged from the chamber, brushing dust from his coat, he carried himself with the calm of a pious farmer, greeting neighbors with nods and steady eyes. None could imagine that beneath their very feet, in a room bricked by his own hands, lives had been broken into silence so complete that even death seemed like a continuation of the lesson. The Doyle homestead no longer needed Bridget's presence to seem cursed. It had grown into its own body of darkness, its heartbeat pounding from the hidden chamber where no sound was meant to escape. And in the stillness of the fields, the earth swelled with secrets that fed the silence Callum worshipped. Each child taken became another verse in the scripture he believed he was writing. A scripture no one would ever read, yet one that left its mark on the land, a scar that deepened with every night he returned to the chamber beneath the chamber. Word count: 800. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 6? Visitors Who Never Return next, building it into 800 words where Callum expands his cruelty beyond children to unsuspecting adults, perfecting more ritualized and symbolic methods of killing? The Doyle homestead began to draw in the wanderers, men who walked the country roads with sacks of wares on their backs or tools slung across their shoulders, searching for work or trade. They were drifters, nameless to the community, men whose absence would never stir alarm. Callum welcomed them with politeness, offering bread and a place at his table. To the visitor it seemed a rare kindness in a hard land, a quiet family giving warmth on cold nights. Yet once the door shut, the house became a trap that no one left alive. Callum understood the value of strangers. They carried no history, no ties, and when they vanished, no one asked questions. Each disappearance was an opportunity to refine his methods, to test new ways of binding the soul through suffering. One such method was born of his obsession with purity. He believed that milk, white and untainted, could hold the essence of a soul if death occurred within its embrace. He prepared barrels in the cellar, filling them with milk drawn not only from his cows, but also thickened with powders to keep it from souring. When a peddler sat at his table, Callum laced his drink with herbs that dulled the body but left the mind awake. Once the man's limbs grew heavy, Callum dragged him below, binding his wrists before lowering him headfirst into the barrel. The milk sealed around his face, muffling cries into bubbling gasps. Callum pressed a lid over the top, listening to the frantic thrashing, the sudden stillness, and then silence. He believed in that silence the soul remained suspended, captured in the liquid, freed of earthly corruption. When he drained the barrel days later, he skimmed off the curdled film and buried it in the soil, convinced he had sown purity into the land itself. Other victims met fates even more grotesque. Callum had long studied the lines of saints' faces in books smuggled from Ireland, their serene expressions locked in death. He sought to reproduce that serenity through torment. In the woods behind his fields, he dug narrow pits not deep enough to cover a body whole. Into them he placed the strangers, binding their arms at their sides, forcing them upright as he shoveled earth around their legs and torsos. Their heads remained above ground, exposed to the sky, their necks strained by the weight of soil pressing in. Callum left them to the crows, who circled eagerly and descended when hunger gnawed. Eyes were plucked first, then lips and ears, until the faces that had once begged for mercy became twisted masks of ruin. Callum sketched each stage in a small book, tracing the way the human expression dissolved into hollow stillness. To him, these were not murders but studies, proof that suffering could be shaped like clay into holy silence. The neighbors dismissed the disappearances. Drifters often moved on, leaving no trace. Peddlers vanished on other roads, stolen by thieves or swallowed by rivers. No one looked too closely at the Doyle farm, where shutters remained closed and Callum's manner stayed calm. He greeted those who passed with quiet courtesy, his hands clean, his voice steady. Yet in the rafters of his home he hid the sketches, hundreds of them, faces distorted in terror and decay, each one labeled with a date and a number. He climbed to the rafters at night, studying them by lantern light, his lips moving as if in prayer. For him, these faces were scripture more sacred than any church's teaching, a gospel written in the language of suffering. The psychological toll on his victims lingered in the air of the house long after their bodies had been discarded. The children he kept below began to absorb the weight of what he did above. They heard muffled cries echoing through the floorboards, the dragging of barrels, the low groans of men half buried in earth. They learned that strangers did not leave, that mercy was a word without meaning. Their laughter, already hollow, grew thinner still, until it cracked like glass when forced from their throats. They lived in the shadow of his experiments, knowing that the bread they were fed, the lessons they endured, were tied to the same order that swallowed travelers whole. Their silence deepened, not only from fear, but from the knowledge that suffering was endless, reaching even those who arrived untainted. For Callum, each death was a confirmation. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a custodian of truths hidden from the rest of mankind. He believed the land itself was enriched by his work, that the milk barrels and shallow graves had planted something in the soil that would one day speak. Every vanishing was a step in his ledger, a calculation of how pain and purity could intertwine. And so the Doyle farm became a place marked by absence, of peddlers who never sold again, of workers who never returned to their families, of faces that lived only in sketches pressed into rafters where no one else dared look. Above ground, the homestead seemed unchanged, a quiet farm that produced its crops like any other. Yet beneath the silence of its walls, Callum's method grew sharper, his faith in cruelty deeper. Visitors came, ate, and were gone, their voices lost in milk or carried off by crows. And though the neighbors told themselves such vanishings were part of the wandering life, an unease crept into their bones, a sense that the Doyle house was not simply a farm, but a maw that swallowed whatever crossed its threshold. The silence of the place thickened, waiting for the night when even the fields themselves would echo with what had been taken. The night came without warning, sharp with the chill of autumn and heavy with a stillness that made the fields seem breathless. It was late October of 1831 when the neighbors first noticed the glow. Lanterns scattered across the Doyle land as though an unseen procession had taken shape. No other farmhouse burned so many lights, and the glow carried far across the valley, flickering in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Families stood at their doors, whispering about harvest feasts or vigils, yet the Doyles had never joined in any communal worship. Curiosity gnawed, and some stepped into the night, walking toward the fields where the strange light pulsed. As they neared, sound drifted to them, low and unearthly, a drone that wavered between harmony and moan. It rose and fell with the wind, layered with tones that reminded some of a church choir, though twisted, strained, almost mechanical. The closer they came, the more the dread thickened, until the sight revealed itself and silence fell upon them. Rows of children stood in the fields, their small bodies lashed upright to poles driven into the earth. Their arms hung limp, their eyes glassy with exhaustion, and their mouths were forced open by iron braces that stretched their lips into grotesque parodies of song. From each mouth protruded reeds cut from the riverbank, jammed down their throats so that every gust of wind turned their breathing into sound. Together the reeds made a chorus not of words but of tones, wheezing and hollow, carried on the cold air like a hymn drawn from the grave. Callum walked among them with a lantern in hand, raising it as though guiding the rhythm. He lifted his arms like a conductor, moving from row to row, tilting his head to listen, adjusting reeds when the pitch faltered, tightening straps when a child sagged. To him this was not cruelty but order, the creation of a hymn no church had dared imagine. He believed he had built a living choir, bodies transformed into instruments, voices stripped of language and remade into pure sound. The children gasped, some choking as the reeds tore at their throats, but the wind pressed through them relentlessly, filling the night with the strained harmony of suffering. For those who watched, horror rooted them in place. They recognized faces children once thought lost or perhaps wandering, now pale and broken, made into props for a ritual they could not comprehend. The lanterns lit their twisted forms in gold and shadow, their bodies swaying against poles as if crucified by silence itself. Some thrashed weakly, their cries reduced to muffled gurgles that only added to the discord. Callum moved among them with the calm of a man tending crops, adjusting, correcting, perfecting. He did not look at the neighbors watching from the dark. His eyes never left the rows of bodies he had cultivated, as if the rest of the world no longer mattered. When one child collapsed forward, the reed tearing free with a wet cough, Callum did not show anger. He raised the lantern over the small body and bent close, listening to the dying rattle as though it were the closing of a prayer. Then he turned back to the others on a bond, signaling with a sweep of his arm that the choir must continue. The wind caught again, rushing through the reeds, and the hymn rose louder, filling the fields with a sound that was neither human nor natural. The neighbors felt their skin crawl with the knowledge that they were hearing death turned into music, suffering transfigured into ritual by one man's methodical hands. Some fled back into the night, unwilling to see more. Others stood frozen, too horrified to move, their minds struggling to believe what their eyes confirmed. They would speak later of that sound, how it seemed to follow them for weeks, echoing in their sleep, seeping into the silence of their homes. For the children bound to the poles, there was no such escape. Their bodies were instruments until they broke, their breath torn from them until the reeds fell silent. The neighbors did not intervene. Fear and disbelief held them back, leaving the children to Callum's order, their suffering unchallenged beneath the glow of lanterns that burned until dawn. By morning, the fields were empty again. The lanterns were gone, the poles removed, and no trace of the choir remained save for the silence that clung heavier than before. The neighbors told themselves they had witnessed a fevered dream or a cruel trick of the night, yet deep inside they knew it had been real. Callum Doyle had orchestrated suffering into song, and the land itself now seemed to hum with the memory of that unholy hymn. The night of lanterns did not vanish from memory as easily as Callum had hoped. Though the poles and reeds were gone by dawn, the neighbors carried the image of the twisted choir inside them like a wound that would not close. Some spoke in whispers at church, others went straight to the sheriff with trembling voices. By week's end, men rode up the Doyle path with iron in their hands, their boots crunching on the gravel as though they were stepping into the mouth of something that might swallow them whole. They found Callum at his table, his ledger closed neatly beside him, his eyes calm. He did not flee nor resist. He allowed their hands to bind him, his face placid as if it were another ritual he had been waiting for. The jail in town was small, its stone walls damp and lined with straw, but it was enough to hold a man while questions gathered. Rumors ran through the valley faster than the river in flood. Children missing, travelers vanished, a field filled with lanterns and song that no one could explain. Mothers swore their sons and daughters had once played near the Doyle fence and never returned, and farm hands whispered of peddlers who had stepped inside that shuttered house and were never seen again. Yet when pressed, not one could provide proof. No bodies were carried forward, no relics of bone or blood that the law could touch. Only stories, spoken with shaking voices, all of them heavy with terror but light in evidence. Callum spoke when asked, but he did so with the restraint of a preacher. He quoted lines of scripture about false witness and the sins of envy. He explained that his wife had died after a long illness, and that his grief had led him to close the shutters, to keep the house dim in remembrance. He said he had 2 children, obedient and pious, who worked the fields quietly and stayed close to home, unlike the wild youths of the valley who trespassed and spread lies. He even smiled faintly when he suggested that neighbors resented his good land, that their accusations grew not from truth but from disputes over fences and rights of water. The men who listened found themselves wavering, for his eyes did not flicker, his hands did not shake, and his voice carried the stillness of a man who believed he was being wronged. The sheriff, bound by law more than fear, demanded proof. When the fields were searched, they found nothing but the ordinary scars of harvest. No poles remained, no reeds stuffed with blood, no shallow graves left unmarked. The cellar revealed only barrels of grain and sacks of flour, stacked neatly as any farmer might keep them. The rafters where Callum's sketches lay hidden were never reached, for no man thought to climb into the dust of his roof beams. What could not be seen might as well have never existed. The law required flesh, and Callum had buried his evidence in silence deep enough to elude them. Days turned into weeks, and the talk that had burned so hot began to cool. Officials began to doubt the testimonies of those who swore they had seen the choir, for fear twists memory and no 2 accounts matched exactly. Some described dozens of children, others only a handful. Some insisted they heard voices, others only the groan of wind. Without bodies, without bones, the case unraveled into smoke. Callum remained calm throughout, sitting with hands folded, a faint half-smile on his lips, as though he already knew that silence was his greatest weapon. And soon enough the sheriff's men unbound him, apologizing in tones that made their own unease plain. They had seized a farmer on nothing but rumor. When Callum stepped back into the daylight, he did not protest or curse those who had accused him. He bowed his head slightly, murmuring that forgiveness was the duty of all men. To those who watched, this restraint seemed proof of innocence. Surely a guilty man would rage, would deny, would plead. But Callum's calm became his shield, and it worked better than violence ever could. He walked home that day with steady steps, his figure small against the horizon, the Doyle house waiting for him like a mouth that opened only for him to enter. Within weeks, more children disappeared. Their families searched the woods, dragged the river, begged at the sheriff's door, but found nothing. Once again suspicion turned toward the Doyle land, yet no one dared approach. Fear weighed heavier than law. Parents forbade their children from speaking aloud of what they thought they had seen in the fields, lest it draw his attention. Neighbors shuttered their own homes earlier, carrying their lanterns close to their chests, hoping the silence of their prayers would keep his silence from devouring them too. The Doyle farm returned to its stillness, its shutters nailed shut, its fields quiet except for the crows circling above. Callum returned not as a man broken by accusation, but as one confirmed in his belief that he could not be touched. The arrest had not weakened him. It had baptized him, proving that suspicion could be smothered if silence was kept and evidence buried. And in that knowledge, he prepared himself for the next harvest, certain that the land, the law, and the fear of his neighbors would all continue to feed him in the work that only he believed was holy. Word count, 700. Would you like me to expand Chapter 9? The fields still moved next, carrying the story into winter with neighbors haunted by apparitions of children wandering where no living voice remains. When winter came, it came hard. Snow pressed down on the valley like a shroud, covering the rows of corn stalks long since dead, silencing the woods and freezing the streams until nothing living seemed to stir. Yet on the Doyle land, silence never meant stillness. Neighbors swore they saw shadows too small to be men, children's shapes drifting across the frozen fields long after dusk. Their movements were unnatural, slow, as though their feet did not touch the earth. Faces glimpsed in moonlight were pale, indistinct, blurred like figures half seen in a mirror. Men who watched from their windows claimed they counted more than a dozen, wandering in crooked lines through snow that held no footprints. When they rose in the morning to look, the fields remained untouched, smooth as glass, yet the memory of those pale forms haunted them as real as frostbite. The sound returned too, low and quivering, carried by the wind that cut across the empty land. Some said it was only the reeds by the river frozen in place, their stalks moaning when the air pushed through them. But others swore it was the hymn they had once heard in autumn, the hollow choir made of children's lungs and iron braces, now carried on winter air as though the dead themselves were still bound to the poles. It rose in bursts, sometimes faint, sometimes piercing, always in the hours before dawn when the valley was at its darkest. Farmers woke drenched in sweat, certain they had heard their lost children's voices, yet when they lit their lanterns the only sound was the crows beating their wings against the black sky. Fear thickened like ice. Fields nearest the Doyle land were abandoned first, families packing wagons in silence, their eyes refusing to linger on the shuttered house that still stood. Others held on longer, but the dread seeped into their walls. Animals refused to graze near the Doyle fence. Wells froze solid, though others in the valley still flowed. Infants wailed at night with no cause, their cries thin and strangled, as if echoing the hymns their parents pretended not to hear. It was not famine or plague that drove people away, but the knowledge that something lingered, that suffering had rooted itself in the soil and would not let go. The Doyle homestead itself appeared abandoned. Windows were sealed tight, the door never opened, the fields left barren. Yet smoke rose from the chimney, curling against the gray sky even on the heaviest days of snow. Neighbors who dared to watch said the smoke was strange, too thick, too black, drifting in a line rather than a column, as if it were not firewood that burned but something wetter, heavier, something that resisted the flame. No tracks ever led to the door, no prints in the snow around the house, no marks of chopping wood or hauling water. It stood like a sealed tomb, yet it breathed, and the valley knew it. The few who stayed grew gaunt with fear, their faces hollow, their eyes red from sleepless nights. They spoke little of what they saw, for speaking made it real. They clung to the hope that winter would end, and with it the strange visitations. Yet deep down they knew the Doyle land did not bend to seasons. What had been done in its cellars and chambers had sunk into the ground itself, into the air, into the very silence that pressed against their throats. And though they turned their faces away, The vision of children moving soundlessly across frozen fields remained fixed in their minds. They were not ghosts in the way churches warned of, but remnants of cruelty, fragments of ritual that walked long after their bodies were broken. The valley began to empty. Homes stood quiet with doors barred, fields unplowed, barns collapsing under snow. Yet the Doyle house remained, its chimney alive, its shutters sealed. The land around it grew emptier, more desolate, until it seemed the house itself was swallowing the valley, feeding on absence as it had once fed on bodies. And in the heart of winter, with no one brave enough to step near, the silence deepened, waiting for the thaw, when what had been hidden beneath ice and earth would rise again. Decades passed, but the Doyle land never softened. The house rotted slowly into its foundation, boards splintering, shutters sagging, yet no one ever claimed it. The valley around it thinned as families left, leaving barns to collapse and fields to return to wild grass. The silence of the place grew into legend, spoken of only in hushed tones. Children of the next generation were told never to wander near the Doyle boundary. Not because of wolves or thieves, but because of something nameless that had once taken root there. The Doyle name itself became a curse. Mothers whispered that to speak it aloud might summon pale shapes back into the fields, and so it lingered only in fearful memory. Years later, in county records, papers surfaced that gave the fear a sharper edge. Old letters traced Callum's time in Dublin, revealing he had served under men of learning whose experiments blurred the line between faith and cruelty. Hidden schools run under the blessing of wealthy patrons had taken in orphans under the guise of charity, only to dissect, test, and silence them in the name of knowledge. Notes scrawled in the margins of Callum's own ledger matched the phrases used by these physicians, tying him back to practices never meant to leave Europe. The Doyle cellar had not been born of madness in America. It had been a continuation, a branch of the same dark order transplanted into the soil of Pennsylvania, where law was too thin to reach it. In the years after his disappearance, laws began to change. Legislators spoke of the dangers of children being handed into private apprenticeship without record, of orphans taken by farmers under the excuse of labor and education. Regulations were written requiring oversight, names to be entered in books, church officials to inspect homes where vulnerable children were housed. Yet these changes were too late for those who had vanished into the Doyle fields, their bodies swallowed by soil, their voices stripped away until only the wind carried fragments of their suffering. The law had been reshaped, but the dead remained uncounted, unnamed, their graves unmarked. For the people of the valley, no reform erased the memory of what they had seen. Survivors carried the scars in silence. Those who had watched the lantern night lived with dreams that never left them, and families who had lost children found no comfort in words written on legal pages. They abandoned the land not from law, but from dread, leaving the Doyle property to stand alone like a warning carved into the earth. Even when the house finally collapsed into ruin, smoke no longer rising from its chimney, the ground remained untouched, avoided as though it still breathed. Hunters swore they saw shapes moving across the fields long after, pale and small, drifting without sound. Farmers plowing nearby land said they heard low tones on the wind, like reeds whistling in hollow throats. Whether imagination or haunting, no one stayed long enough to test it. The legacy of Callum Doyle was not one of name or bloodline, but of silence. His cruelty had thrived because silence shielded him. Silence of neighbors too afraid to act. Silence of law that demanded proof where proof had been buried. Silence of victims who had been broken until no voice remained. It was silence that allowed horror to root and grow in plain sight, wrapped in the appearance of innocence and the language of Scripture. That silence outlived him, turning into a shadow that followed the community even as generations changed. And so the story ends not with justice but with absence, with fields that no one farms, with ruins that no one rebuilds, with names that no one dares write on stone. It ends with the question that lingers whenever evil hides behind ordinary walls. Could it rise again? Cloaked in the same calm smile, shielded by the same silence. The Doyle house may be gone, but the pattern remains, waiting for those who will not speak until it is too late. What do you think? Could this happen again?